Good afternoon and a very warm welcome everyone to this online policy dialogue organized by the European Policy Center on the upcoming Hungarian parliamentary elections. Hungary will go to the polls on 12 April in what may be the most competitive election since Viktor Orban returned to power 16 years ago. A new challenger has emerged in Péter Magyar and his Tisza party, which according to recent polls has managed to mobilize a broad coalition of voters and could potentially end Fidesz long hold on power. This raises several important questions. Could this election really mark the end of Orban's era? What would Magyar's promise of regime change actually entail? And perhaps just as importantly, how should the European Union prepare for continuity, for change, or perhaps for something in between? To discuss this and other related questions, we are joined by three excellent speakers. We have Zsuzsanna Vech, Program Officer at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, Edith Zgut-Szybelski, Assistant Professor and Research Affiliate at Central European University Democracy Institute, and Eric Maurice, Policy Analyst at the European Policy Center. Many thanks to our panelists for accepting the invitation. As ever, I will first have an exchange with our speakers and then I will open up the floor for questions and comments from all of you in the audience. If you plan to send written questions instead of raising your hand to intervene live, please use the Q&A box and keep your queries short so I can read them quickly and fit in more interventions in our short time together today. And with that, let's get started. I would first like to turn to Zsuzsanna to help us, let's say, set the scene a bit. Zsuzsanna, how should we understand the current state of the race between Fidesz and Tisza? How solid is Péter Magyar's rise in the polls and why? What explains, in your opinion, his ability to mobilize voters so quickly?
Thank you very much, Corina, for having me. And happy to try to answer the question. So what we are seeing now in Hungary is really the first time since 2010 that Fidesz and Viktor Orbán faces a strong unified opposition party that challenges his grip on power. And this challenger is actually a newcomer. Péter Magyar appeared on the political scene only 2 years ago, and his party is a little over a year and a half year old. Indeed, in this period, he managed to build a very strong following and support base behind his party without cooperating with previously existing opposition forces. This helped him to set his own agenda without going into any sort of negotiation and power sharing among various actors. And in hindsight, from his perspective, this seems to have been a winning strategy. He also has been very successful in driving an agenda that brings real grievances of the society into the forefront, focusing on the shortcomings of the governing parties, 16 years of governance, the lack of investment into education, healthcare, social services. He also managed to pinpoint the hypocrisy of the governing party that portrays itself as a party for the families, for children, protecting family values, and yet not standing up to protect abused children in state institutions. I think this very strongly resonated with a wide range of the population, who at the same time also see the ongoing corruption of the governing party as some of the causes why there is not enough money for all that the population would need. In this context, what Magyar managed to achieve is a self-driven agenda. He managed to navigate the political landscape without being forced into a reactive position, which is very new in the Hungarian context. He does his thing, and that seems to protect him from all the smear campaign that goes on against him and his party. So really, it seems that the governing party is losing grip on him. It does not seem like the standard strategies work against him. So what we see now is that Tisza has been strongly leading since the start of 2025. That was when Tisza took over Fidesz, and has been building indeed a wide coalition in the population, as you mentioned. The latest polls already show a double-digit lead for Tisza in the entire population, in the lower double digits. But when we look at the decided voters who know which party they pick, in some polls it went up to 20 percentage point, which is an unprecedented lead for any opposition force ahead of Fidesz.
And among those voters, which groups are shifting away from Fidesz? And do we know the profile of the voters, of the potential voters for Magyar and Tisza?
So Tisza has seemed to be able to break with what held back previous opposition coalitions. Previous opposition coalitions, opposition parties were particularly strong in the capital and some of the big cities across the country. And Fidesz, on the other hand, had a very strong foothold all over the country, in smaller towns and especially in villages. That seems to be somewhat shifting. Fidesz is still significantly stronger in villages, but in smaller towns, there is a move towards Tisza. That's one shift that we are seeing. Another thing is that the middle-aged population is starting to move towards Tisza. So people between 40 and 65 are slowly somewhat shifting towards Tisza, whereas Fidesz managed to maintain its strong base among the oldest generation and especially those who are retired. Fidesz has very much lost ground in new voters and the youngest generation. That is absolutely dominated by Tisza. And that's very interesting because parties with such profiles as Fidesz in Western Europe are typically rising due to the support of young voters. And that's very different in the case of Hungary, where Fidesz is losing support there.
And how would you explain that?
Well, I would say it has multiple causes. One reason I believe is that in Western Europe, these parties are typically not in power, and they appear as something new to try. Whereas in the case of Hungary, Fidesz has been in power for 16 years, and many of the younger voters have not seen anything else. And they don't necessarily see their country going in a good direction, so they are more open to an alternative. But the other thing is that Fidesz didn't have to use the tools that the younger generations typically use to consume news media to rise to power, which is very often used by far-right parties in Western Europe as a channel. And it came to build this outreach very late. So Fidesz relied more on traditional media, and it did build a very massive dominance in the Hungarian media landscape. But that's typically not what the youngest generation consume on a daily basis. So there is a mismatch between where Fidesz is present and where the young people are.
Thank you so much. Edith, let's move to the campaign dynamics, because the electoral contest in this case appears unusually polarized. The government has portrayed Magyar as Brussels and Kiev puppet, while the opposition has framed the election as a chance for systemic change. Would you say that in the end, this campaign is actually quite typical compared to previous Hungarian elections, or are we witnessing something different this time?
Thank you, Corina, and I'm very happy to be on board on discussion. I would say both. So I think like structurally, this campaign is quite familiar for everybody. But when it comes to context and content, I think the last 2 years have been very different from what we've seen before. I mean, first of all, this economic environment, which has been usually alluding to, I mean, it's fundamentally different in previous elections, especially in 2018. Fidesz could campaign on strong economic growth, EU-funded projects, massive pre-election spending, etc., etc. And this time, this is mostly missing. I mean, partly due to EU funds, which are frozen, and there are no major economic success stories. Instead, we see stagnation, even periods of recession, and there are no spectacular infrastructural inaugurations either. So this is something which certainly weakened Viktor Orbán's economic narrative, while it also gave a momentum to the opposition. First time in a decade, as you started to discuss with Zsuzsi, the election became genuinely competitive because of a very innovative party itself. I mean, I think Tisza itself is something which is an innovation, not only because I think most voters would feel that by 2024, the traditional opposition parties completely failed to present something credible alternative. And this was a momentum when Péter Magyar stepped in. But the novelty here is that Tisza itself is innovative because it could push Fidesz into, after 2 years of dominating the political discussion, into a very reactive campaign. So it's Fidesz that is reacting right now and following, or it has been following Tisza for 2 years, and it has been lagging behind the party itself. And the structure of Tisza is something which we haven't been witnessing for 16 years in Hungary. I mean, it combines movement style, mobilization, with a very highly centralized leadership style around Péter Magyar. And one of the most interesting elements in this is the Tisza Islands. I mean, these are these bottom-up local communities that are formally independent from the party. Like, for instance, group of citizens like Friends, group of Friends can organize themselves as Tisza Islands. They can mobilize protests, campaign events, they can recruit volunteers, and they can coordinate through digital application Tisza World. And this is, I think, two very important purposes. It gives the movement itself democratic legitimization, but it's also about political education. So this is a new element, like it teaches people democratic norms, participation. And that's the thing. I mean, this hyperpolarization that we're talking about here, which is like extreme in Hungary, this has an unprecedented positive effect right now in the society. There is extremely high level of political engagement. Also in small settlements, as Zsuzsi mentioned, like there is a shift, like where we knew that there were lots of dependency structures. People were afraid to go on the street and to engage with oppositional, or I wouldn't even say there was significant things happening there, but there is something has been moved and pushed also in smaller settlements. And that's certainly something new. But I wanted to also point out to a paradox here, because, despite all these new kind of dynamics, Fidesz hasn't fundamentally changed the strategy of campaign. So the campaign is still about fear-mongering, fear-based mobilization, and extreme polarization. And the central narrative is the war, sovereignty, and external threat, which this time is coming from Ukraine. So that's the propaganda message about that Tisza and Ukraine, they're two in one, and Ukraine is financing Péter Magyar and Tisza. And I think what's very striking that public attitudes were dramatically shifting in this regard. So there is also a public attitude shift against President Zelensky. He's been technically unknown within Hungarian society 4 years ago. And today the polls are showing that while, for instance, Hungarians are rejecting Vladimir Putin, like 67%, 64% also has very negative view about President Zelensky. So he's been technically dragged into the mud, of this Hungarian domestic propaganda war. And so this is exactly where I think things are a little bit the same, like geopolitics once again might help Viktor Orban, and these recent developments escalation between Ukraine and Hungary and President Zelensky's threat last week. This is something which might provide some ammunition to Viktor Orban's campaign, which was completely stuck in a mud, as Zsuzsi mentioned. But right now, it might reframe the election around the war and national sovereignty once again. At what we learned in the last 16 years is that fear-based mobilization works extremely well for Viktor Orban. So ironically, even without economic momentum or growth or major campaign innovation, the politics, geopolitical fear of Viktor Orban we can call it, like war psychosis, might still help them to catch up in the polls at the end of the day, also with the help of tremendous amount of propaganda and fake news and disinformation. I'll probably stop here and we can elaborate further.
I mean, he used the word successfully last time around, if I remember correctly. So I wouldn't be surprised. But two short follow-up questions. The first one, I'll start with that. What about the EU? How is EU politicized in this campaign, if at all?
It is always politicized, maybe not as much as it has been throughout the campaign in 2018 and 2022, before everything has been turned towards and against Ukraine. So ever since Viktor Orbán came back to power in 2010, the EU is the meta level kind of external enemy in terms of threat towards national sovereignty. There has been excellent academic and policy research on that, showing exactly how Hungary has been using and fueling the fears, also national historical grievances of Hungarian society, because of the post-communist kind of history and heritage. Everything has been directed towards the European Union. So the European Union is a constant element which is depicted as the ultimate kind of negative and threat towards national sovereignty. Right now, the slightly different kind of element is that Ukraine is in the spotlight, and President von der Leyen and European Union are in the background as, so to say, like puppets of Tisza, which is both financed by Ukraine and Brussels.
I see. And the second follow-up question I had for you is, how significant are disinformation, online manipulation, foreign influence in shaping the campaign environment? I mean, we've seen lots of news about this and the links with Russia. What can you tell us from your analysis and reading?
Well, I would say that disinformation and manipulation these are not like peripheral tactics. These are like central to the campaign strategy of the government. The campaign entered into a new phase in three aspects. I'm sorry, I just have to drink a little bit, sorry. And so three aspects. One of them is the government has pushed propaganda into a new level, I would say, with artificial intelligence generated smear campaigns portraying Péter Magyar as a foreign agent of Ukraine, as I mentioned. And these videos and these narratives are circulating online and offline. It's quite overwhelming, I would say, and effectively funded by taxpayers' money. At the same time, so it's not just about naming, blaming, and shaming and fueling this thing online. There is an escalation of diplomatic tension effectively happening between Ukraine and Hungary to the extreme. I mean, as everybody heard in the news, last week they captured the Ukrainian cash transport in Hungarian motorways and framed it as an evidence that this is a money which was transported through Hungary, which is corruptly financing Tisza, that this was fitting into this kind of narrative that Tisza is something which is threatening national sovereignty and financed by Ukrainian mafia money, so to say. And the second is that we have increasing evidence, both by investigative journalistic work, but also by Western NATO / other, like partners confirming that there is a new level of Russian possible interference into Hungarian campaigns right now. And we haven't witnessed such thing before to this extent. So what we see is that what we heard about is that Russian operatives are increasing their activities in Budapest. So we're talking about GRU people like military intelligence who have been very active also in Moldova to influence elections there. And this has actually raised concerns that the Kremlin might be paying much more attention to the Hungarian elections than it used to in the past, when Viktor Orban, didn't have a potential challenger like what we have today, and it was much easier for him to win elections. And nobody has to be a geopolitical expert to figure that Russia has clear strategic stakes in keeping Viktor Orban in power, because Hungary is doing everything in its power in the EU in order to block Ukraine's EU integration and NATO integration. And from Moscow's perspective, this makes Hungary a very valuable geopolitical kind of tool vessel inside the EU and NATO itself.
Thank you, Edith. Maybe a question for both you and Zuzana. Because analysts have raised concerns about the fairness of the electoral playing field in Hungary. So how confident are you both that the election outcome will actually be accepted and implemented without contestation? I don't know who wants to, maybe Zuzana, to give Edith a break.
Sure. So the election is not unfolding in a fair context. That's not something that we really need to discuss. It's not. We can expect that the tactics that were in place before are going to be in place this time around. A big question is how the election day will unfold. And in that regard, I think we might see increased election day manipulation as well, bribing people for votes, putting pressure on people to vote in a certain way, busing people to districts to issue their votes where the competition is maybe closer. These tactics will be there. What is going to be really important is that the opposition party can send delegates to the voting districts to monitor how the election day unfolds. And these delegates can report back to the headquarters on what they see and what the actual results are that were counted. So this can be some sort of a safeguard to really report what has been put in the ballot boxes. And I think the role of international observers will also be crucial. But we also need to be prepared that there will be fake observers. And we also need to have in mind that these are very often party allies. So we might have effectively Western European like-minded politicians in Hungary reporting that everything was in order. And then that's a question how you deal with that also in Western Europe domestically when your far-right parties are getting involved in such ways. But about the contestation, it depends, in my opinion, on how close the election will be. If the results are close, I definitely expect that it's going to be contested, maybe in a number of districts that can decide where the majority goes. One side note, it's not only Fidesz and Tisza going against each other. There are smaller parties as well, and one of them, the extreme right party, does have a chance to make it into the parliament. So the question really is whether Tisza can gain a majority against a coalition of Fidesz and the extreme right. So I do expect contestations in close districts. I don't think that we will have the final results in the days after the election. If the gap is bigger, if what we are seeing now that there is a big gap between Fidesz and Tisza, if that doesn't close, Fidesz will have a much harder task of coming up with a result that brings it out as the winner. And that would come at significant political costs.
But added very, very, very shortly, if the opposition were to win, are there institutional, constitutional mechanisms through which Fidesz could actually still retain influence?
Well, I really like this question because I think it brings us to a very interesting conceptual debate about hybrid elections and hybrid regimes and elections, whether if it's even possible to have or we're going to have elections taking place in Hungary. And I think I agree that the real question is not that whether those, we will have them, but whether those in power will be willing to accept defeat. And I agree with Zsuzsi that if opposition, it's a matter of margin. If it's going to be a small margin, I agree with her that we should expect contestation. Like one mechanism could be like selective legal challenges to single constituency results. So in order they try to reduce or overturn parliamentary majority for the benefit of Fidesz. We're already seeing this kind of preparation for, they're building the legitimacy narrative for this. The government is claiming that the opposition is financed from abroad and this represents foreign interest. So it can easily lead to this kind of conclusion that Fidesz victory is somehow illegitimate. I think we might also mention that the very classic coup d'etat scenario is less likely. Like parts of the Hungarian state apparatus, meaning law enforcement, the police, I think they're reportedly very reluctant to engage in some sort of overtly unconstitutional action. I think what is very important here is that what happens if Fidesz accepts that Tisza win, but Viktor Orban still has a huge informal power clout and a structural kind of dominance to remain extremely influential within this context. So Hungary has developed something which is a captured political economy. So this is a very important pillar throughout corrupt networks of loyal business elites and friends and family and media holdings and state institutions. And throughout this whole machines, informal power could actually leverage on the new government and act as a deep state, so to say, to influence and potentially undermine a new government. So I think this is also something with which we would need to calculate in the long run, not to mention state institutions that will be completely controlled by long-term Fidesz appointees. So it also means that systemic change would likely be very gradual, if there is a shift in power rather than an immediate.
Very interesting point. In the interest of time, maybe let's look a bit at the EU dimension before I open the floor for questions and comments from our audience. And I turn to Eric for that. Eric, in your latest publications for the EPC, you argue that the EU should be cautious about, simply assuming that an Orban defeat would automatically lead to a political reset with Brussels. Why? Why should the EU be careful about overinterpreting a potential Magyar victory?
Thank you, Corina. If I may, I would add a follow-up to what Zsuzsanna and Edith said about the context in which the elections are taking place. And I think when we hear what they just said, it reminds me of countries like Venezuela or Belarus or these kind of undemocratic countries. But the difference is that it is in the EU, and the EU can have leverage. And I think ahead of the elections, the EU and EU leaders, maybe next week at the European Council, should make clear to Viktor Orban that he should not go that way, and that the EU would be ready to take more sanctions and not to allow this kind of electoral manipulation, which would be unprecedented in the EU. Concerning your questions, I think the main trap that the EU should avoid is to think that if Péter Magyar is elected, everything would go well and he would do the opposite of what Orban has been doing, and that the situation would improve clearly. And I think the two key elements there are, of course, the rule of law, expecting the full restoration of rule of law, and of course, the alignment of Hungary on EU policies and EU strategic interest. If we look at Péter Magyar and Tisza from an EU perspective, Tisza is affiliated to the EPP at EU level, so the European Popular Party, the center-right. But I think we should not forget that Magyar was raised politically in Fidesz and spent all his adulthood until 2 years ago in Fidesz, and probably his political instincts are still being shaped for a great part by these years. And if we look at and that's what I did in the publication with our partner Geopolitics, who did some data analysis of the European Parliament voting record. Tisza, among the EPP parties, is one of the most aligned with Fidesz, meaning they vote the same as Fidesz on a number of issues, including Ukraine, opposing amendments to strengthen the language on the support of Ukraine or the condemnation of Russia. They also voted against further institutional integration of the EU in favor of a security-first migration policy. And also, interestingly, for the EU, they also voted against amendments to strengthen the Article 7, the rule of law procedure, which is underway with Hungary. And also, if we look at the Tisza manifesto for the elections, again, from an EU perspective, of course, it's a kind of back to Europe agenda. Tisza pledges to be a trustworthy EU member and NATO ally. It pledges to meet the criteria for joining the euro by 2035, to join the European Prosecutor Office, which would be a big step in the anti-corruption fight in Hungary. But this is in a way pro-European in the Hungarian context. And I think what Zsuzsanna and Edith explained about Péter Magyar is that basically he's campaigning on the message that Orban has not delivered for the Hungarian people, but that he could deliver, but he doesn't say that he would cut completely with all the policies and all the political positions of Fidesz. And in the manifesto, that's clearly said that he would oppose an accelerated integration of Ukraine in the EU. Of course, he's not the only one, and he would not be the only EU leaders to do that, but that's what he says. He would continue the current non-support to Ukraine, and Edith and Zsuzsanna explained how unpopular Ukraine, or at least Zelensky, are in Hungary this time. And also, he's very clear in his opposition to the current proposal for the next EU budget for the coming period. He would be a big defender, a strong defender of Hungarian agriculture, so making an agreement on the next budget more difficult. And he's opposed to the Migration Pact. Also, he would not change much Hungary's position on that. So I think the EU should not assume that Magyar will be mainstream in the sense that he would follow easily all the main ideas for the EU. He would probably be a fairer partner than Orban, but not an easy partner in itself.
Thank you so much, Eric. I see that we have quite a few questions that were sent in writing. I would also like to invite our participants to raise their hand and their virtual hand and intervene live. At this point, the floor is open. And while we wait for them to do so, maybe I will pose you some of the questions that I can read here. Perhaps more relevant to Edith and Zsuzsanna is the question from an anonymous attendee about why voters still support, or why is there still support for Orban? So could you also highlight policies or developments that are viewed positively by parts of the Hungarian electorate to help the audience better understand why the government, so Fidesz and Orban, still maintain significant support? Perhaps we can also touch on how we explain that. And there's another question that maybe one of you wants to address, linked to the Hungarian Socialist Party, if I'm attributing the acronym correctly, the MSZP. How is it featuring in this election and in the future of Hungary? So maybe we can start with those two questions for you two, and you can cherry pick. Yeah, let's start from that, and then I'll come back to Eric. Who wants to go? Yeah, Edith, go.
Happy to jump in.
Yes.
I'm happy to jump in. Happy to jump in with the question about how come that Viktor Orban is still so popular despite the fact there is no economic growth and everything else. So in a nutshell, I mean, I think it's a very successful kind of delivery machine that has been built up in the last 16 years. It's let's call it informal power, and let's imagine it as a kind of a stick and a carrot kind of approach. So the carrot is about very targeted benefits or promises to specific electorate, which has been targeted by Fidesz for 16 years. It's mostly traditional married couples with children and the elderly. So they're getting specific tax benefits for mothers, for instance, who would have 2 or 3 children. So they wouldn't need to pay taxes. Very compelling kind of ideas for married couples and pensioners. And the stick, I think, which is also very important, is that there's a lot of informal pressure going on, within the society. And the more vulnerable these people are, and the more smaller settlement they live in, the more effective this informal power on them. This is how you would need to imagine this. So when voters feel and how the everyday life, they feel that they're dependent on the government. So their job, their existence, everything is dependent on them, have to vote for Fidesz. And for many vulnerable voters, like especially poor, elderly, or Roma communities, for instance, this choice is not that much of ideological very often. It's often about them trying to avoid this kind of economical or social risks and to keep their jobs, in smaller settlements. So what we see in the numbers is that the poorer, the more vulnerable, and the less mobile somebody is, both in terms of geographical mobility and social mobility, these people often do not vote for Fidesz because they identify themselves with it, but because the system is very deeply embedded in their everyday lives. So, and others, of course, are voting for Fidesz out of conviction. That, for instance, they're conservative. They would believe that this is the safer to support the party that they already know. I mean, this is something we very often just forget about, how simplistic this explanation is, that they want to vote for something they know, and they simply don't want to vote for something which is unfamiliar for them, and they feel like it could be a threat to change. So this is a super effective self-reinforcing system. It's a political economic machine which has been built in 16 years. And yes, this is dried out of money as we see it right now, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't work, in effect and in practice, also in the heads of the people in an everyday practice. So,
Zsuzsanna, do you want to react as well?
Yes, of course. So maybe just a thought to what Edith has already said. What I think is also very interesting, that Fidesz really focuses its strategy at the moment on fear-mongering. And that is not new. But the way it is being done now, really targeting and provoking a designated enemy, is to generate more and more material for this campaign. And that's what the campaign is really built on. It's not about any sort of program for the future. And that shows that this is also a mobilization game, that's going to be crucial. And Fidesz needs everybody who already votes for Fidesz to show up on election day. By the way, Tisza as well. But then on the other question about the role of the Socialist Party, it doesn't have one. In fact, the Socialist Party has already been on a downward trend before this last political cycle. But what is very interesting about this campaign now, that most of the smaller opposition parties, which were active in the campaign in 2022, stepped back. And they are not competing in the election. They haven't set national lists. There are 3 parties, and one of them is left-wing, centrist, pro-European party, the Democratic Coalition, which was a splinter of the Socialist Party led by former Prime Minister Gyurcsány. This party is still running. And in fact, it's running a campaign where it seeks to differentiate itself both from Fidesz and Tisza, and run on a pro-European left-wing ticket. But it's quite unlikely at the moment, looking at the polls, that Democratic Coalition will make it into the new parliament. The other 2 parties that are running are the extreme right, our homeland, which is measuring around 5%, which is the electoral threshold. So it is most likely going to get into the parliament. And then we also have the two-tailed dog party, which is a satirical party. It also managed to set a national list, but is doubtful that it's going to get into the parliament. So if we look at the landscape now, we still have a left-wing party that is running. And let's put the two-tailed dog party aside for a moment. Everybody else is right-wing. So we have really a right-wing competition, and we most likely are going to have a completely right-wing government, even if Tisza brings in a variety of people and its candidates may be somewhat more diverse. The party itself is a member of the European People's Party. And this is unprecedented. So the left, for now, is pretty much gone from the political landscape.
I want to bring, we have some hands up, so I will bring those in shortly. But Eric, maybe to come back to you, what would be a cautious and strategic approach from Brussels if Orban were to lose? And there is a question which you might be able to address linked to what we can expect in terms of economic policy if Magyar is elected. If you are able to respond to that, then I'll give the floor to you.
Thank you. For the last question, Edith and Zsuzsanna may be better placed, but what I understood from Péter Magyar's campaign is that his first priority is the anti-corruption and the unblocking of the EU funds to foster growth, economic growth, which would help also achieve his promises on social welfare, education, and so on, what was mentioned before. And I think he presented as his future or potential finance minister someone who worked for, I think it was Shell, so someone who's well integrated into international business and who was a kind of reassurance or credibility token for his economic policy. But mainly, he would like to unblock the EU funds, which leads me to your first question about the EU approach. Of course, the kind of litmus test will be rule of law, first from the EU, but also for Magyar if he wants to have this EU money. So he will need to give quick guarantees or adopt quick measures to restore the rule of law. And then we come back to the question of how Fidesz could keep influence both on the political landscape, but also on the economic environment. What will be the margins of maneuver for Magyar? That's a very difficult question to answer right now. But that will, the EU should not expect something very, it could be like in Poland. Even with the best, willingness to change things, it would be very, very difficult because of what has been established by Fidesz, and is very difficult to undo because of the constitutional requirements and the majority of 2/3 needed in the parliament. But the EU should have find the difficult balance between helping Magyar, because it's in the EU's interest that Fidesz doesn't come back in 4 years from now, or is not in a position to prevent the restoration of the rule of law. But at the same time, the EU will have to maintain the credibility of the rule of law instruments and not do what it did with Poland, meaning unblocking the funds before any results. So that will be, I think, the real difficulty. And also I would say that Péter Magyar would have to clarify a lot of things. What would he do, if he sits in the European Council? What will he say about Ukraine? What will he say about foreign policy, about migration, and so on? What would be the trade-off, the political compromise he would be ready to accept from the EU? So rule of law and how to adapt with someone who's more open than Orban, but also who would be governing in a context where Fidesz could be putting pressure on him constantly. That will be the difficult situation we could face.
All right. Let's hear from some of our participants as well. I see first on my list Sandor. Sandor, are you with us? Do you want to pose your question now?
Yes, can you hear me? Can you see me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So thanks very much for this webinar, really interesting. I want to hear your opinions, whoever wants to react on, we see these tensions between Zelensky and Orban and Ukraine and Hungary, which is quite unprecedented. What's your estimation? Where will it go in the upcoming months? And also, how do you see, Zelensky's behavior lately? Because last week he made these remarks about Orban, which many interpreted in Hungary that was a threat. How will this impact the campaign, and how do you feel like what Zelensky wants to do with this? Is it for domestic use, or what is it? Thank you.
Thank you. I also have Solveig. Sorry if I mispronounce your name.
No, it's perfect.
Please go ahead. Ask your question or comment. I don't know what you have.
My question was also actually similar to the one just asked, but I also wonder if we could, because usually migration in Hungary is a big theme as well, but this time it seems to be like Zelensky and Ukraine have somehow taken over. But is migration still a theme in Hungary at this point? That is my question. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And to that, I will add also, because we're talking again about campaign, there's another question sent from our participants linked to the decisions of Trump administration and the war in Iran and everything. So if you can also touch on that in your responses. And last but not least, I have York. York, you can come in now. York, are you with us? Okay. York? All right. York? Okay. So maybe he left in the meantime. So let's come back to you. Who would like to go first? Edith, maybe you want to start because you were silent for a while.
I can, and actually all these questions which has been posed brings us to the question of Pavel Havlicek, who was also asking, like, can Ukraine really bring Orban back to the floor and help him mobilize the electorate? I mean, as I argued in my intervention, I think the more this whole campaign is about the division between Ukraine and the Hungarian government, the better it is for the government genuinely, because this is the field where they can very comfortably and confidentially maneuver and frame their polarization tactic between the opposition and themselves and portraying them the way how I told how they're portraying them, and also depict Viktor Orban as the guarantor of peace and normality in Hungary. So that's one thing. The other thing is that I think it brings us to the question of how to read the polls, because as Zsuzsi mentioned, like there is a huge advance in the polls, at least those that have been taken in the last couple of months, and it shows an advanced Tisza advantage ahead of Viktor Orban. But does it really mean that it's going to be translated into an electoral victory? And I think we have to take it with a grain of salt, not because my colleagues in Hungary are not doing an excellent job on the ground, like Median and other pollings. I think they're doing very specifically measuring the mood of the society, but we have to put this whole into a Hungarian context. So two things are happening. First is that the Hungarian public sphere is heavily distorted. So media pluralism has been completely eroded. The government communication often resembles like very systematic, so that it does on a daily basis, systematic propaganda, which makes the public opinion very hard to measure effectively. So there are also gaps in the whole. Just imagine it that it's very hard to reach out to certain electorates, especially in the countryside, to get out what the people really think and how they're going to vote and who is actually going to go to vote. The second is that as I started to explain, the key part of Fidesz support itself, it cannot be captured in surveys, because the key to their success, electoral success, is this kind of delivery machine that I just started to mention. This regime, which has been built very powerfully around mobilization. It's a mobilization machine, how to get people actually to cast a ballot on election day, that it can deliver votes even when the public support is declining, as we see it right now. So it can still intimidate, it can still use soft coercion, it can still use many different ways of actually get out the vote on election day. And it's not only about the election day, because this machine is active 24/7 in between elections, every day, all day, with unlimited resources. So this is how you have to imagine it. And what I wanted to mention by this is that in hybrid regimes like Hungary, elections are not just about, decided primarily by public opinion, but exactly by mobilization capacity itself. So that's one thing about right now, the campaign towards a little bit shifting, so that it's more advantageous or better for Viktor Orban, like 2 months ago, when Tisza could still keep the focus on domestic issues, domestic governance, quality of governance, corruption, and crumbling public services. So right now, the strategic kind of challenge for Tisza is to redirect the focus on these topics and keep the focus on this agenda and not on the war, because it's going to be extremely difficult to win this within the conditions that I just explained here.
Mm-hmm. Eric, do you want to come in?
No, I will let Zsuzsanna.
Okay. Zsuzsanna?
Maybe just to follow on what Edith was saying about the campaign topics, and to link back to Sándor's question about Ukraine briefly. It was very interesting to see that actually this was maybe the first time when Zelensky made those comments about threatening Orban last week, that Péter Magyar was forced into a position to react. And this is really not good for him. He needs to move back out from the terrain where the governing party is dominating and winning. So from a strategic perspective, if we look at the Hungarian context, President Zelensky's remark was absolutely counterproductive. The thing about this, though, is that the Hungarian government noted that provocation seems to work. So I think in the next 1 month, what we will see is actually continued provocation towards the Ukrainians. Whatever can be used to support the campaign will be used, and we can expect that there will be also fabricated materials, AI-generated materials also enlisted here. So Sándor was asking how far it will go. I do expect escalation in this regard. One turning point could be if the Druzhba pipeline is reopened. because then Orban would sell that as his big personal success. But that's also a difficult thing. On Trump, since you brought that question in, Corina, I find it very interesting.
I didn't. It was one of our participants. And there is another one, if I can extend it. How do Hungarian voters view Orban's focus on engaging with Trump and MAGA? And in general, arguably his occasional priority to international affairs over domestic politics. Does this help or hurt him in the eyes of these middle-aged potential swing voters? So if you can embed it in your response, yes, sorry.
It distracts from the domestic topics of Péter Magyar. So in that sense, it may help just to redirect attention away from the winning topics of Péter Magyar. And that is why if you look at the government's campaign, it's absolutely not about domestic issues. It's about what kind of threats we are facing that only Orban can save us from, and how big a leader he is, very respected internationally, and the only one who is taken seriously on a global stage. That's the main message. And Trump fits into this, and it's a good product for Orban to sell towards his core electorate. What I find more interesting about this, though, is that there has been a lot of talk about a potential Trump visit ahead of the election to Hungary. Now we have the date of CPAC Hungary, 21st of March, but we still don't know if and who would be coming. At Secretary Rubio's visit just recently to Hungary, the responses around this topic were very wishy-washy, that, the life's busy, global politics are busy, anything could happen. So we don't yet see that big forthcoming support beyond the political endorsement from the United States that Prime Minister Orban expected. In fact, what we do see, although it's wrapped up nicely, is that the American administration is putting pressure on the Hungarian government to gradually, but eventually start diversifying in the energy field from Russia. So there are pain points, whereas there is, of course, the political support still for Orban, because Trump does think that he can work with him. But there are hard geopolitical interests, and one of those is Hungary's close ties with China and dependence on Russia that doesn't sit well with the administration. So I think it's a much more complex, problematic and relationship that the Hungarian government tries to portray.
Right. And maybe to you and Edith, very, very briefly, though, because we're running out of time. And it's a question, part of the question that York wanted to pose, but he couldn't because of technical problems. So what could we expect in the scenario where Fidesz and Mi Hazana coalition were to come to power? If Orban stays, what could we expect? More of the same, something different?
From a Mi Hazánk Fidesz coalition, so York's question. More of the same to a certain degree. So Mi Hazánk is quite small. It would be a supporting junior partner, I think, happy to be there. And gaining more legitimacy, but it would be more of the same. And I would expect in certain areas, actually radicalization from a Fidesz government. Mi Hazánk or not. We see that there is a lot of work being put into preparing a series of reports by the Sovereignty Protection Office, naming who are various actors in Hungary, who they claim to be influencing the political environment, representing foreign interests. I think that is a preparation for further potential crackdown, although the legality of the sovereignty protection law that is the basis of this office's foundation is under case in the Court of Justice. And an opinion has already showed that the law is against EU law, but the Hungarian government has a strong track record in disregarding that. So more of the same in certain areas, escalation.
Right. Edith, very, very briefly.
Okay, I agree with Zsuzsi. I think it would be certainly further deterioration of both quality of democracy and governance. And I think there would be just very, I would say, looks like a natural cohabitation, not even a collaboration between the far right and the extreme right. But at the same time, because, Fidesz has been technically implementing and incorporating every single idea of Mi Hazánk and Jobbik from the last 16 years. So there would be something would flow naturally. I think it would be more like a challenge for Mi Hazánk itself, because they might be aligning with Fidesz completely, but I'm not sure about their electorate. Their electorate might be more autonomous. They might be more anti-establishment. So how I see it, there would be like a Polish scenario that Fidesz would eventually very quickly swallow Mi Hazánk, and they would be completely disappearing from the ground. That's one thing. And the other thing is that that would eventually, it would just be an add-on to this kind of further radicalization of the government, because it was happening anyway without having them formally on board.
And Eric, for the last few seconds of our discussion, first, York is also asking, could the characteristics of the electoral system work in favor of Tisza in these elections? And also a final question from me, what is the single most important decision that Brussels should take in the first months of a new government in Hungary? 30 seconds.
Yeah, I think if we have a Magyar government, the first thing would be to talk with it and to negotiate and to agree on a concrete action plan to restore the rule of law, but a realistic one with, this what EU knows how to do, its milestones, targets, and a calendar to restore the rule of law, and with a strict monitoring. We need to agree on that and not waiting for improvement to happen, or not unblocking the funds without any result. And on Tisza chances, well, we understood that nothing will be done before the election or even after. So if the elections were free, I guess Magyar would win, but we understand that a lot of things could still happen, and the EU should be also very, very clear on that sanctions would follow. And even if Orban stays in power, well, how to desescalate what he's been doing in recent weeks and months. He would be empowered, and it would be really, really difficult to deal with him, I think.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much to all of you for these very, very interesting insights. Also, thank you to our participants who have been particularly active, and we very much appreciate it. I think today's discussion reminds us that elections can change governments, but they do not automatically change systems. And whatever the result in Hungary will be, the real question is what happens the day after. And we will discuss what happens the day after in an election monitor in which we will analyze the results the day after the election. So please join us also for that debate. And in the meantime, I wish everybody a wonderful afternoon, and many thanks again for this great conversation. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.